All right, welcome again. This is Fred Diamond. I'm the co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales. And of course, I'm also the host and the producer of the Sales Game Changers podcast. This is a special series of interviews that I'm doing with the author of Crossing the Zone of Fear, John Knotts. And this is a Sales Game Changers podcast. So we're also doing a 7-episode series on John's book. And if you've been with us for the first 5 episodes, thank you. If you're like me, listener, you probably are noticing everything that's coming up as a fear. But John, as we're doing episode number 6 right now, everything is appearing to me as a fear, but not as a trembling, sit in the corner fear. For example, today, again, we're doing today's show in the beginning of September 2024. I run the Institute for Excellence in Sales. And as an organization, we work with great sales leaders. I also need to invite people to become customers. And I notice, like, if I'm not making a phone call, if I'm choosing, quote unquote, not to make a phone call, what's really there? And I could say, well, it's 4 o'clock and people don't answer their phone, blah, blah, blah. I can make all these excuses, but I've come to realize that there's a fear in the way. And it's not, I'm scared to death of people and, yada, yada, yada. It's something is stopping me. What do you think?
Yeah, and this is where fear is insidious because it really it's so quiet and you don't really know what's going on. But when you step back and you ask yourself, we run into this all the time. Like we choose not to do something, but we never really challenge our choices and really, like, well, why am I choosing that? Why am I going to do that? Why am I not going to do that? When we start to unravel the reality behind it, it's like, well, yeah, I'm concerned that somebody or something's going to happen, and so we step away or step around it. If you ever worked in a corporate environment where there's that one person that you work with that everybody has to tiptoe around them and eggshells and because they're, like, oh, I don't know if I want to work with them. But they don't recognize that as like fear,
Yeah.
like, oh my God, I'm terrified. And this is why like imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
which is very common with
Yep.
people, is something that we don't really recognize because we don't really know how to diagnose it
Yeah.
until it's like really bad. And then we're like, well, something's going on.
Yeah. Somebody posted on LinkedIn today the concept of imposter syndrome. And I said in my reply, I said, imposter syndrome is the new black. Orange is the new black because it comes up all the time. But back to what you were just saying a few moments ago in the corporate setting, yeah, we've all been in meetings and, there's an opportunity for us to contribute. And for some reason, we choose not to. And it could be, well, we have a fear of offending somebody or a fear of looking stupid or a fear of, I always tell people this too. When you're in the corporate world, you're always reporting to somebody, right? And that person's reporting to somebody, and that person's reporting to somebody. Even the CEO is reporting to the board, right? And then the board of directors, in theory, is reporting to the major shareholders, right? So there's always somebody you're
There's
reporting
always a
to.
customer.
There's always someone above you. So there's this reluctance, resistance sometimes to really say what's on your mind, and that goes back. There's a fear. Well, what am I afraid of? Am I afraid of getting fired? Am I afraid of insulting someone? If I get fired, well, that means, like, you told the story on one of the previous episodes where you went to the wrong restaurant and you were afraid. I think it was episode 4, where you were afraid of telling your wife that you went to the wrong episode because whatever the story and the fear is, which we've resolved, doesn't really mean anything. Same thing too in the corporate world. If you're afraid of contributing something in a meeting, it's not going to be on your permanent record, right? Things are going to move on.
Yep. Well, the big thing here is that if you really want to if you really want to identify this, catch yourself justifying why you're not doing something.
Yes. Yes.
Because like you said, like when I'm not making that phone call and I start giving myself reasons.
Yes.
Why are you doing that? Like you've made a conscious decision, live with your decision, but
Yes.
that's because your psyche is saying something's going on here and maybe you should pay attention to it. It's kicking you in the butt, but you're not listening. And you just like, and that's that when I talk about that story about going to the wrong restaurant, ordering from a restaurant that was the wrong one and going to pick up the food. And then I'm driving home and I start telling myself this story that I'm going to tell my wife of why I
Yes.
am running late. And I'm just like, what are you doing? And then when I was like, I faced it and then I immediately told her, yeah, I did this. And oh, by the way, on the drive back, I was actually thinking about what story I was going to tell you,
Yes.
which is kind of inherent in what we're talking about with this chapter. But you sometimes you just got to put it out there and say, you know what, I'm afraid of this.
Well, like you said before on the show, false evidence appearing real. And, back to the imposter syndrome, when I made that comment today on LinkedIn, I said imposter syndrome is the new black. But I also said in my comment, I said, you know, um, recognize it and then realize nobody else cares. When you're in a business world, yeah, there may be somebody who doesn't like you. Who cares? But the rest of the office isn't around saying she's incompetent or he doesn't know what he's talking about. They're thinking about what they're going to say next, right? Or how they're going to do what they're going to do next. And their job, most people, really aren't sitting around thinking about you as an imposter. Most people aren't sitting around thinking about you and your fears, which kind of like makes it fold away. Just one quick thing. You talk in this chapter, in chapter 6 or episode 6, before we get to our final chapter 7, you talk about various fears. I've always shifted one. You say the fear of heights. I've come to the conclusion that it's the fear of falling, right? As
Exactly.
compared to the fear of heights. It's like, I've gone into tall buildings and the chances of me, big buildings they have guardrails and they have glass enclosures. The what used to be known as the Sears Tower in Chicago, they don't want anybody to fall off of their building, right? As high as it is, let alone 50 people or even one person. So I've always
And
said
I
that.
think that's the important thing about this chapter
Yeah.
is it really we're taking everything that we've learned in the previous 5 chapters and we're putting it back in front of everybody that everybody has fear.
Yeah.
If somebody tells you that they're fearless,
Yeah.
it's because they've just learned how to deal with the fears. If
Yes.
somebody is a thrill seeker,
Yeah.
they're not a they're not fearless. That thrill is driving an emotion in them. It's because of the fear they thrive on it. They're like, yes, I love that energy. It's just like when I said that I was terrified as a kid doing public speaking.
Yeah.
I do everything in my power to get out of it, to not do it because I'd be terrified.
Yeah.
But now I love it.
Yeah.
And I've learned that there's an energy that comes with fear.
Yeah.
And if you can harness the energy, you can actually turn that into excitement and energy for what you're doing.
Yeah. And, the people that really do achieve more things in life are the ones like we talked about in a couple episodes. You're not really getting out of your comfort zone, you're expanding, comfort zone. As we're talking about this, I'm thinking about professional athletes, like Michael Jordan, always wanted the last shot. LeBron James always wants the last shot. There's probably 200 guys who are in the NBA who are unbelievable athletes to get to the NBA. They don't want the ball in the last minute. They might be happy spending their whole career playing for, one of the teams that's in the bottom 10%. Yeah, they're still getting the 2, 3 million. They're still
Yeah.
professional athletes, but the fear of there's a few guys who have achieved that level, and some guys have been unlucky. But it's and even Michael Jordan with the ball, he wants it, but he's probably not totally totally
This is
comfortable.
how this book so ties into my other book, Becoming Unbelievably Successful,
Yeah,
because it's this holds you back.
Yeah.
and it will stop you if you, I mean, because the whole idea of unbelievably successful
Yeah.
is that you are challenging yourself to a point where you know you can't achieve it,
Yeah.
but you're going to do it anyways. And that's the whole, definition of courage is feeling the fear and doing it anyways.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I had a very good friend who unfortunately passed away, who was a billionaire. He created uh, three companies that each surpassed a billion. And I remember one of the last times I saw him, we were just kind of hanging out. You know, we were just talking. He was asking me to remind him of some stories from him back in college and some things that he had done. And he always thanked me for encouraging him and pushing him. But I remember thinking, my buddy here is a billionaire, and we just had a conversation like two friends, right? So it's the same thing. It's like you're still humans and you're doing more. And that kept one thing that I've learned from this book, and I've always said everybody has possibility for great things. I've identified what really is stopping uh, me and people I work with from getting to the quote unquote next level. It's this interpretation of whatever the fear might be, and the reality is it's not in reality. So next week we're going to have a great show, episode 7, the final episode. We're going to go through some exercises, but before I do, at the end of this chapter, you talk about some ways to start getting us thinking about getting past the fear. And you talk about talking to others, right?
Yes.
So you list 5 different things. Let's kind of talk about them for a minute before we kind of end today's show as a tee up to episode 7. Find a trusted and supportive listener.
So when it comes to trust, there are a lot of people that we know who will tell everything about what we say to them to other people.
Mm,
And then there is that one or two friend or family member that really recognizes that this is something that I should not be sharing with other people. And those are the kind of people you really want to look to and bring close to you for support when it comes to fear, because they're the ones that you can just really be honest with. I I work with a lot of CEOs, presidents, and owners of businesses, and one of the things when you're at that echelon is that they don't have anybody to talk to.
yeah.
They can't go talk to their spouse.
Yeah.
They sometimes can talk about things with the HR director or the chief of human resources or whatever it is. But for the most part, they have very few people that they can even speak to about the things that they're dealing with. And as a chief operating officer, fractional chief operating officer, I come in and I've seen everything that they've seen, and I know what they're going through, and we can have those kind of conversations that are in complete trust.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go out and tell anybody what we talked about. And that's the kind of thing that you need to find.
Yeah. So you also talk here about be specific about your fears. I remember, God, it was probably 30 years ago. I was a marketing director for a technology company, and we built a new organization was built to bring the company into a new space. And they brought in a guy who was brilliant, just a brilliant guy. And they acquired his company, and he was tasked. He was made the GM, general manager of the division, and I was the marketing director. And we spent some time, and I had a lot of respect and appreciation for this guy. I remember one time we were sitting there, and I said, "What do you think we're going to, or how are we going to do this?" And he looked at me and he said, "I have no idea." I remember thinking at that moment, I was like, "Okay, you know, good for you." And we put a plan in place. He brought a team together, and we eventually came up with a plan. But I remember he was like, "I have no idea." And I remember thinking it was like, he was specific about that, right? His next thing is like, be specific about your fears. I remember thinking, okay, good. Now I get it. And now we can start building something.
And that's one of the, as we talk about in the next episode, we'll talk about some of the 15 exercises that are in the
Yes.
book. But the number one exercise is to name your fear.
Mm,
And I know we'll talk about this again because it's so important that if you don't sit and take a look at what it is, you said it's not a fear of heights, it's a
yes.
fear of falling.
Yes.
And when the idea of heights is not the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is, could I fall? And then you can really think, well, could I really fall?
Yeah.
Well, they're not really going to let me fall off this building. So,
Yes.
but if I'm like out on the edge of a cliff and there's no handrail and there's nothing tied to me, maybe the fear of falling is a little bit more, acute. But the idea here is if you are very specific about naming it,
Yeah.
it really helps you define what it is that I'm really afraid of.
I had a incident a couple of years ago. I was speaking of being on a cliff with no handrails and no ropes or anything. Was I live in Virginia, and about 3 hours away are the Blue Ridge Mountains. And Virginia is such a beautiful state with so much scenery in the southern and the western side of it. Also on the eastern side, there's the ocean, of course. So anyway, I did this one day, like a weekend trip, just drove 3 hours south, and it was hiking to a beautiful falls. And the hike went up and down through these crevices, and you had to climb up some rocks to make it to this. It was a 2 mile trail. And I got there early, and I had hiking boots, and I found a sturdy stick, and I didn't have anything to drink. So I remember at one point I was like, oh, I'm going to get dehydrated. And I sat down about a mile in. It was a Sunday morning, and this mother and her 4-year-old come walking by, and the kid's wearing flip flops, and he's just like bouncing. And I'm like, okay, all right. So if a 3-year-old kid wearing flip flops, can easily walk this, traipse up to these falls, I'm overthinking what could possibly go
Yeah.
wrong. You talk about using I statements, you talk about being open to feedback. I want to touch on the last thing you mentioned, and this has been a huge shift for me. I want to talk about this for a little bit. You talk about be patient and kind to yourself. And one thing that I've adopted recently is when I notice myself being stuck because of a fear, I've started saying when I notice it, and one thing the book has helped me do is to notice those things. Like, okay, you're stuck. Well, what's the fear that's stopping you? And then I've said to myself, give yourself grace. I literally say, quote, to me, give yourself grace. And all of a sudden I'm like, I forgive myself for, whatever the fear might be. And then I'll also say, okay, well, again, why are you afraid? Is it worthy of being afraid?
You're not a lesser person.
Yes.
And again, let's go back to like the whole purpose of this chapter is everybody has fear.
Yes.
It's okay. You're not a lesser person. And if we beat ourselves up because we have a fear of heights, and like my mom has a fear of heights, my wife has a fear of heights, I do not. But I do, in a sense. I'm just more comfortable because I feel the invigoration of getting out on the edge and doing these things where my mom is paralyzed and she sees me doing it, like, oh my God, get him away from the edge. But that's how we respond to it. But we can't beat ourselves up because we have emotion. That
Yeah.
would be like, I can't be sad, I can't be happy. We don't live that way.
Yeah, the example of the being, I'm picturing myself. I went on a trip to Boston a couple of years ago, when we went to, I forget the building that's right, it overlooks Wrigley, Fenway Park, etc. And we went up to the top, and there's beautiful views of Boston. And I was with somebody who was scared, the whole time. She was sitting off to the side. Meanwhile, I went right up to the wall, to the glass, and looked down. And I remember I said, the reason I'm bringing this up is I knew that they would not have opened this observation tower if anybody was going to even remotely fall. But then I also said, well, I'm not going to take a hammer and start cracking. We're not telling people here, be reckless.
Right.
We're not telling people go climb to the top of a cliff and jump off without without a harness
Parachute or
or a
anything.
parachute. Yeah, that's stupid. Jumping out of a plane without a parachute is stupid. Jumping out of a plane with the
You may
parachute,
survive, but
you're not going to survive. And we're not telling people either. We're not telling people call your best prospect at 3 o'clock in the morning on their cell phone. You know, yes,
That's
you should be.
reckless.
Yeah, that's reckless. You're going to lose the business. Now
Right.
I've heard some stories where customers have said, I get to the office at 3, meet me at 3, right? That's something different. But no, we're not going to tell people, yeah, your customer is definitely not going to be busy besides sleeping at 3 o'clock in the morning. So call them then because there's a great chance they're going to pick up the phone or text them. No, that's stupid. There's a difference between fearing and doing something and stupidity.
Right.
You didn't write a book called Crossing the Zone of Stupidity.
Stupidity.
Maybe that's your next one. All right, we're talking to John Knotts. This is episode 6 of the Crossing the Zone of Fear podcast. At the very end of John's chapters, he says he has notes, and I go through what I write down. And this note, at the end of this chapter, he said, how much better do you understand the impact of your professional fears on your personal and professional life? And I wrote, I realize that almost everything now has to do with a fear before it, coming before it. I've been more conscious of this, like we talked about on the show. It's like everything now shows up as a fear. And again, some of them are so sublime that it's like, okay, you're afraid of making phone calls because you're afraid they're going to hang up on you, or maybe you're afraid they're even going to pick up. Okay, well, that's the
What
business that you're
happens
in.
if
Yeah. What happens if you talk? I tell people all day long, the secret to sales is getting to the next conversation. Okay, well,
Yep.
what if I call someone and they pick up the phone? You're in the space of the next conversation. Can you specifically pinpoint what you were really fearing? And this was interesting. I wrote, yes, I guess it all comes back to for me as a fear of rejection. But as you know, and a lot of people listening, I'm also an expert on chronic Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses. And I wrote a book, of course, called Love, Hope, Lyme, and I do a podcast called the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. The reason I bring that up is a lot of people have choose to identify what they call the root cause of all the challenges that the diseases are calling them, and it's a very very challenging, troubling yet necessary process to take. How deep do you think people need to get to truly understand the root cause? Like I just said here, oh, fear of rejection. Okay, well, do I need to unpeel the onion, John, to really
well,
understand and the people listening?
you're 68 pages in and you've now you're starting to recognize all of this fear. And I'm going to read something from somebody who left a comment on Amazon about this book. The book was bought at when we had our book signing last year.
Yeah,
This a husband bought the book for his wife, and this is something she said: I'm able to finally make tangible and learn what has been in my mind for a long time and not allowing me to continue with several things I used to do but couldn't. So think about that. This is the impact that 68 pages
yeah,
has in that book. You all these things that are have been going on,
yeah,
you're starting to go, wow, like I didn't realize that this was happening.
yeah.
And now is the moment. Answering these three questions leads you to the next moment and our next episode of what do I do about it?
Yeah, it's funny. There's an old joke. David Brenner, comedian who passed away, one of his classic jokes was the bravest guy in the history of the world was the first guy to drink milk, right? And it's like, of course, now everybody drinks milk, and it's the same type of a thing here. It's like, you may have this trepidatious fear, but a lot of the stuff that you're fearful of, like I told you, this my story with hiking through the mountains, and this kid walks by on flip flops, and I was like, okay, all right, Fred, you know, let's acknowledge that for you it's a fear, but the reality is it may not be a fear for many people, and you need, if you're listening to this, you're doing something in business and you want to get better, like we've talked about many times in previous episodes. All right, the final question is, has this chapter helped you better understand your own fears? And like I mentioned, yeah, it absolutely has. Recognize, like we talked about in the beginning of the show, that everything truly that you're not doing or that you're even doing, but with the degree of trepidation, there's something underlying, some type of a fear. And the reality is, you need to get through them. You might make a bad decision, but at the same time, is the fear holding you back from moving forward? Any final thoughts, John Nuts?
I just you're tying it together really well, and that is I mean, right where we are in the book, that's what this is all about.
All right. So once again,
Hopefully, by the time you get here, you're like, oh, the light bulbs are going off. And
all
this
right.
is
So
what, as a process improvement person,
yeah,
the whole effort of process improvement is getting to the root cause.
yes,
Because when you know the root cause, then the
yes.
next logical question to ask is, what are you going to do about it?
What are you going to do? All right. So we've gone through half the book in 6 episodes. I'm excited to read the rest of the book, and we'll bring to you, our good and friendly listener, things that you can do, like John just said, to get to the root, address your fears, cross the zone of fear. All right. John Knotts, the author of Crossing the Zone of Fear. My name is Fred Diamond. Look forward to talking to you next week.